We would like to invite everyone to please rise and join us in singing the Philippine National Anthem, to be followed by our prayer.
Sa simoy at sa langit ng baha, may nilagang tula at awit sa paglayang minamahal. Ang kisap ng watawat mo'y tagumpay na namimingin, ang bituin at araw ng kailan pa may magdidilig. Lupa ng hawak at ipagsinta, wala langit sa piling mo. Ang ligaya
Good afternoon, everyone. Welcome to the 9th episode of the Kagitingan, the PVAO Historical Webinar Series 2021. I am Nico Oreiro.
And I am Felicia Lois Lanya. We are your hosts for today. Before anything else, allow me to acknowledge the presence of the following: PVAO Administrator Yusek Ernesto G. Carolina, PVAO Deputy Administrator Raul Z. Caballes, NHCP Chairperson Dr. Rene R. Escalante, NHCP Executive Director Mr. Restituto Aguilar, PVB Vice President Mr. Mike Villarreal, Mount Samat FTED Administrator Mr. Francis Enitorio, Dr. Neil Marshall Santillan from the University of the Philippines, Dr. Jose Romel B. Hernandez from the De La Salle University, Dr. Archie B. Resos from the University of Santo Tomas, and Professor Marlon F. Agoy MC from the Polytechnic University of the Philippines. Right now we have about 65 Zoom participants, and for those who were unable to pre-register, we are currently being broadcasted via Facebook Live on the official Facebook page of the Philippine Veterans Affairs Office. And right now, we have about 79 Facebook viewers.
Yes, before we officially begin the program, here are some reminders for all of us. In case there are lags, just stay on and wait for it to load again. Zoom attendees are on mute to avoid background noises. If you have questions, you may use the message box for our Zoom attendees, or use the comment section on the Facebook live stream. And after the webinar, the participants who registered are encouraged to answer the evaluation form. The link will be sent on their emails. Now, just a quick recap. In our last episode, which was held on May 12, we have learned more about the Makapili and other Filipino paramilitary groups during the Japanese occupation of the Philippines. Exploring the period's dark age, Dr. Maria Felisa Sihuko Tan explained the stories of various groups that collaborated and supported the enemy during the war, one of which was the most influential among the category, the Makapili.
For today's episode, we are welcoming back Dr. Augusto V. Viana of the UST Department of History. He will be presenting the issue of collaboration during the Japanese occupation of the Philippines.
Yes, so without further ado, let us begin our program with an opening message to be given by the chairperson of the UST Department of History, Dr. Archie B. Resos.
Good morning. I am Dr. Archie B. Resos, the chairperson of the University of Santo Tomas Department of History. And again, let me extend my heartfelt gratitude for the Philippine Veterans Affairs Office by providing us a roadmap towards historical awareness that promotes the courage and bravery of our countless soldiers, most especially the veterans. These battle-tested men and women who took part in liberating our country during the onset and the end of World War II remain close to our hearts. Instilling the value of honoring the veterans in public as an endeavor should never be forgotten. As most of us have been confined in our homes brought about by the global pandemic, social media is now used as a platform to substitute the actual social engagements in human life, especially for our work and school. This can be used for our advantage in bringing history closer to the minds of the Filipinos in the comforts of their homes. People will be able to learn, decipher, unravel, and critically analyze and judge for themselves about historical and factual imagery of the Second World War. Also, the combined efforts of the Philippine Veterans Affairs Office and the University of Santo Tomas Department of History, together we will preserve and promote the valuable contributions of the veterans instilled in the minds of our countrymen. Special mention goes to our teachers and students of history. For today's episode, we have Dr. Augusto V. Viana, an esteemed faculty member of the UST Department of History, who will deliver his presentation about collaborator, the issue of political collaboration during World War II. Immediately after World War II, the issue of collaboration, for instance, has not featured as one of the national issues in any of the post-war elections, except in 1946, when the people voted into office a number of so-called collaborators. However, in 1949, Jose P. Laurel, the president of the wartime Republic of the Philippines, was the Nacionalista Party's candidate for president, and his defeat resulted because of the poor showing of the Nacionalista Party to address the major issues hounding the country at that time. This would include insurgency and poverty. The issue of collaboration ceased to be a national concern, not because there was a silence to it placed around the collaboration question, but because it was no longer relevant to national politics and to the immediate post-war concerns of the Filipino political leaders or elite. The most pressing issues would be rehabilitation and economic development of the country. Nonetheless, the collaboration issue remained an integral and significant part of Philippine history, as Dr. De Viana will shed light to the issues, development, and decisions made by the Philippine and American government to the so-called collaborators. I would like to congratulate Undersecretary Ernesto G. Carolina, Administrator of the Philippine Veterans Affairs Office, for this noteworthy historical endeavor to strengthen scholarly awareness, and I would like to commend Dr. De Viana in advance for this interesting topic about political history. Again, maraming salamat PVAO at maraming salamat UST. Mabuhay po tayong lahat.
Thank you very much, Dr. Archie Rezos, for your welcoming message.
Now we are honored to introduce our speaker for today, Associate Professor Augusto V. Viana of the UST Department of History. Professor Augusto V. Viana acquired his doctorate degree in history in the University of Santo Tomas, where he also took his degree in Bachelor of Arts in Asian Studies and Master's in History. Before joining the academy full-time, Dr. Viana was the chief of the Research Publication and Heraldry Division of the National Historical Institute. He was also the former chairperson of the Department of History of the University of Santo Tomas. His research interests include a wide range of topics in Philippine history, Japanese history, World War II, Philippine-Japanese relations, Micronesian history, history of the Malay world, oral history, and documentary research. Dr. Viana has written at least 6 books on Philippine history, World War II, and the history of the Marianas, among which was Apples and Ampalaya, bittersweet glimpses of the American period in the Philippines. Collaborator, the issue of political collaboration in the Philippines during World War II. He has authored a textbook for the Rizal course. As a co-author, Dr. Viana wrote 6 textbooks for Araling Panlipunan. He authored more than 30 articles on history, which appeared in the Sahara Journal of the University of Malaya, the History Journal of the Charles Sturt University, New South Wales, Australia, and the journal Kagitingan Wilaya of the Indonesian Academy of Sciences, in addition to local journals like the Unitas and Filipiniana Sacra, the University of Santo Tomas. Ladies and gentlemen, Professor Augusto V. Viana.
So, good day. I'm here to talk about collaboration issue from World War II. Collaboration is a very complex matter because it involves a lot of persons and involves many principles, many circumstances. So, first, let us define what's collaboration. So collaboration can be defined as the willful adherence of a country citizen working for or with a foreign enemy. For example, an enemy country, especially an enemy country. When people collaborate with the enemy of their country, they work against the allegiance of their sovereign. In the case of the Philippines, if you collaborate, let's say, with another country, and it waged war against you, you sided with that country, and you work with them, that's called collaboration. So collaboration comes from 2 words, from the word co and labora. Co meaning between, labora, you work with, you work with the enemy or with somebody else. And what is bad about collaboration? Because you help your enemy achieve its objectives in your country. For example, when people collaborate with the enemy, they make his job easier. So they give aid and comfort to the enemy, and to the detriment of your own country. So again, as what do collaborators do? As I said, they provide aid and comfort to the enemy. They have free resources that the enemy can use for other objectives. We have a long tradition of collaborators. For example, when the British invaded the Philippines, some Chinese who living in the Philippines sided with them, so they collaborated with the British. And as a result, when the Spaniards eventually returned after the Treaty of Paris, they were punished. Many of them were deported. So another example would be fellow Filipinos who collaborated with the Americans in capturing Aguinaldo. Let's start with Januario Galut, that Igorot, who served as a guide for the American forces and pointing out the secret passage where Gregorio del Pilar's forces can be attacked from behind. And also, we have the Macabebes who helped capture Aguinaldo in Palanan. So, collaborators sila. And again, there are also even collaborators working within the government of Aguinaldo. Like these two persons, si Pedro Paterno and Felipe Camino. Even when they are members of Aguinaldo's government, they are secretly liaising or communicating with the Americans and telling the Aguinaldo's government that it's better to be under the Americans, which made the people like General Antonio Luna very angry that they ordered their imprisonment. So Mabini also ordered their imprisonment, but since they were so influential, they had Mabini removed from power, and even Antonio Luna was assassinated. Okay, so collaboration is a criminal dimension, and there's one thing that we would call criminal collaboration, and it falls under the crime of treason, punishable under Article 114 of the Revised Penal Code. And those who are guilty of criminal collaboration can be punished through a fine of 20,000 pesos to the death penalty. That's according to the Revised Penal Code. Okay, and however, however, treason can only happen during times of war. For example, if your president is showing adherence to another certain country, saying that you should show utang na loob and that we should allow them to fish. Actually, he's working against the interests of the Philippines. He cannot be charged of treason. In fact, there was a case filed against I'll say this now, President Duterte, accusing him of treason, but this was thrown out of court because treason can only happen during times of war. When war breaks out, even acts before the event can be invoked. And the crime of treason needs to be proven to a two-witness rule, meaning two witnesses are necessary to prove a certain act of treason. You need two witnesses, and but only one count of treason is needed to convict a treason indictee. For example, let's say President Laurel was accused of treason more than, I think, if I'm not mistaken, more than 100 counts of treason, and actually only one count is necessary to convict him. And the punishment would be from 20,000 pesos to the death penalty. If you would like to ask those people who are studying law, what would be the precedent when treason trials happened in the Philippines after World War II? We had no precedent, but we also only had to depend on the experience of the United States, especially what happened during the Civil War. That's why you have the two-witness rule. Okay. Now let's ask, why do people collaborate with the enemy of their country? First, for political purposes. They think that they could collaborate, thinking that they can be leaders at their time. For example, if you are a political leader in the time of, let's say, Quezon, you have been under the influence of Quezon for quite so long. They've been in the limelight for so long. And now that they're gone, they're with MacArthur and they're now in the States. So maybe it's their time to shine. And they can only do that by collaborating with the Japanese. Okay, so another reason would be economic. Working with the enemy may bring economic windfalls. You can become rich by collaborating with the enemy. Especially when you are used by the enemy to supply their needs like food, equipment, and raw materials. So you have what you call a buy and sell merchants, those who sell scrap metal to the Japanese. They are economic collaborators. And many of them became rich during the war. for cultural purposes. There are some Filipinos who believe that espousing what the enemy wants to happen um, will improve the country's culture, such as Philippinism, Asianism, your hatred against America, US imperialism, Western culture. Maybe it's your time to collaborate. So it should be noted that during the Japanese occupation, the Japanese considered Philippine education as heavily influenced by the United States, and that the Philippines must have its own system of education. It must use its own language instead of English, the Tagalog language rather than English. So that's why you have writers who were very active during the Japanese occupation. There are also writers who were active in the propaganda, spreading pro-Japanese propaganda by writing in their so-called puppet newspapers, okay, or even appearing or participating in radio programs glorifying the Japanese. There are several kinds of collaborators during World War II. We have the political collaborators. These people are the ones who helped the enemy, such as the Japanese, in administering the country for them. So in Europe, we have Vidkun Quisling, who was the Prime Minister of Norway during the Nazi occupation. And in the Philippines, we had high government officials like Laurel, Recto, Paredes, Quirino, working in the national government. There are also some officials in the local governments, like the mayor of Manila, who was who served during the Japanese occupation. So all local officials who served during the Japanese occupation, including the members of the Philippine Assembly, they are the political collaborators. They free the enemy time and provide manpower for the enemy to allow them to pursue his other objectives. So they even serve as puppets. They do what the Japanese would tell them. Now we have economic collaborators. As I already said, those who trade with enemies, providing with material, especially with war material. These are also people who recruited workers, entertainers, sex workers. That includes the comfort women. They provided the women for the Japanese in the authorized brothels. By collaborating with the enemy, they earned income, and some of them became tycoons, while most of their country starved. And economic collaborators can also be considered as economic collaborators when you serve in their employment. So because you are starving, therefore you have to work with the enemy and maybe work as their driver, so work as their vendor for their goods, or buying their goods, and at the same time you are selling them and you're profiting economically. That makes you an economic collaborator. There's also cultural collaborators. These are the people who help create and disseminate propaganda for the enemy, and these also help those who are involved in spreading or participating in their cultural objectives. For example, I put here one general, at least two generals, General Aguinaldo and General Recarte. Early during the war, they helped appeal to the Filipinos, especially the soldiers fighting in Bataan Corregidor, to lay down their arms because the Japanese were not our enemies, and the Japanese came on as friends. So they're used for propaganda. Of course, so we have Felipe de Leon, who was famous composer during the Japanese Marcos administration. In his earlier days, he was also involved in writing songs for the Japanese. Of course, we have Lope Santos, he was also involved, not because he loved the Japanese, but he was used to propagate or promote the Filipino or Tagalog language, and that served the purpose of the Japanese. And there's also the military collaborators, those who help the enemy in military activities by taking arms to support them and fight their fellow Filipinos. They serve as spies, informants, and guides for the enemy. So, and they also those who assisted in the interrogation, torture, and killing of their own countrymen. Okay, so they wage war or levied war against their own countrymen. Now, examples of military collaborators were these people: the Yo-in or United Nippon, in Bamboo Army, by the way, United Nippon, they serve as guards for Japanese camps. They're usually wearing khaki uniforms with short pants, and they're given Japanese rifles. Bamboo Army is a militia, which is armed just with the bamboo spears, but later they were used as guides and informants of the Japanese. Another one would be the Palaaks. So that's another group. So these are military collaborators, and they existed, especially the first two. They were very much involved in the. They existed mostly in the Tagalog region, okay, and also with the basic bakal ng mga Tagalog founded by Aurelio Albero. So he decided not to join the Makapili, or again, aside from the Makapili, which he helped create. This was a paramilitary group, and according to them, this was to protect the Filipinos from the Americans. And the Borong gang, this existed in Zamboanga. It's a pro-Japanese gang. So there's also one in Cebu, the Dimanjug armed group, pro-Japanese, and also the most famous would be the Makapili, which was founded on December 8, 1944. Before the Makapili have these groups, if somebody tells you, these Makapilis were the one wearing bayong on their head and pointing at who's the guerrilla, but if these were founded before December 8, 1944, these are not Makapilis. These are probably members of these other groups, okay, or they are probably individual collaborators. Okay, so these military collaborators caused the death and destruction during the war, especially during the last months of the Second World War. What happened to the Filipinos when the Japanese invaded? Again, using the theory of Arnold Toynbee of challenge and response, they said that Toynbee would say, one challenge, one response. But I would say one challenge, but there could be many responses. They either resisted, by joining the USAFE, becoming guerrillas, or they collaborated. They become political, economic, cultural, and military collaborators, or they both resisted and collaborated. But the prime reason why they did was survival, okay, as well as revenge. If you are if you want to fight back against the Japanese. So again, what is the historical context of collaboration? In the 1940s, the Philippines was woefully unprepared to defend itself when the Pacific War broke out. The Japanese bombed military naval installation and began landing in various points of the country. And it was evident that the Philippines will fall into the hands of the enemy. And what they are going to do. So President Quezon called a meeting of his cabinet. I think that would be in December 16, 1941. And there was General Douglas MacArthur, who was now the head of the United States Armed Forces in the Far East. And Quezon began to choose officials who should be with him. By the way, MacArthur said that it is imperative that Quezon must not fall into the hands of the Japanese, because if he did fall to the hands of the Japanese, that would be a bad for the prestige of the United States. And thus, President Quezon needs to be evacuated. And Quezon chose officials who should come with him and those who should stay behind. Okay, so according to him, somebody must be left behind to protect the people. Okay, so at first, Quezon wanted Laurel to be with him when he evacuates, but he changed his mind and decided that Laurel and Executive Secretary Jorge B. Vargas should stay. And they said they should protect the people and cushion the effects of the upcoming enemy occupation. And both men posed a question to Quezon. He said, to what extent they should cooperate with the Japanese, because they could be accused of being traitors if they did so. So hanggang saan ba talaga mag-cooperate itong mga tao? Kami. Of course, he said there might be a misunderstanding, and by the time you come back with the Americans, you may punish us, and we don't want that. And the question was given to General MacArthur, and he said, do anything except take the oath of allegiance to the Japanese. And Quezon told the two to do everything to minimize the sufferings of the Filipino people. And thus, on December 24, 1941, Quezon evacuated to Corregidor. And later, he left Corregidor to flee to the United States to start the government in exile. So it left the government in the hands of Executive Secretary Laurel and Secretary Vargas. But before leaving, Vargas was named Mayor of Greater Manila. It was done so because in the belief that the Japanese will not interfere in local matters. By the way, Greater Manila is the predecessor of today's Metro Manila. Ayan, so, and on before the Japanese entered Manila, they met the first elements of the Japanese Expeditionary Force in Binyan, Laguna, and negotiated with them. And on January 2, 1942, the Japanese entered the city proper. General Masaharu Homa, who had the Japanese forces, proclaimed the end of the American rule, and the Filipinos must now cooperate with the Japanese. That the Filipinos were not their enemies, only the Americans, and feelers were sent to Filipino leaders, especially Senator Quintin Paredes, who became the emissary of the Japanese to the Filipino leaders, including Laurel. And they met in the house of Jose Yulo. Jose Yulo in Peña Francia Street. And they discussed, what should we do? They said that what government to form? They said, number one, continuation of the Commonwealth government. Number two, Gobierno de Hierro or Iron government, meaning a government backed by military force. Next, it would be a puppet government or Gobierno Muñeco. And they also wanted that government should be limited only to providing services to the people, like collecting garbage, providing health services and education. But the Japanese demanded none of this. And they totally rejected the continuation of the Commonwealth government because it was a creation of the Americans. So how about the government backed by military force? So it's just between the military force and this puppet government. And the Japanese were not satisfied with Filipino officials just taking care of things like garbage collection, protecting peace and order. And they said that the Filipinos should cooperate closer. So they had nothing to fear because the Americans will not be coming back. That's what they said. And Paredes also said, why not we demand independence from the Japanese so that as a condition before we collaborate? Oh, that is a very attractive propositions. But Jorge Bocobo, he was president of UP, said that whatever government that the Japanese would help establish would likely be a puppet government like that one in Manchukuo or in China under Wang Qingwei. They're supposedly independent, but they're actually puppet governments. So they're in a quandary. And they would the Filipinos insisted on continuation of the Commonwealth government and said, and the Japanese under General Masami Maeda became exasperated and said, just form a government. And of course, and there's also fear that more pro-Japanese Filipinos might be utilized in forming the government. And so they decided to create a government when they made a response to the Japanese request. And they created a resolution in which they said that they are constituting themselves as a Council of State. Okay, these are mainly political leaders at the time. They are former heads of government, secretaries of government, headed by Executive Secretary Jorge Vargas. Since Jorge Vargas was the one reading the response, the Japanese designated him as the head or the executive commissioner. The government called the Philippine Executive Commission was formed on January 26, 1942. But before that, the Japanese, through the Japanese military administration under General Masami Maeda, governed directly. But above General Maeda was the Japanese commander-in-chief, that was General Homa. Yeah. So, the Philippine Executive Commission lasted from January 26, 1942 to October 13, 1943. That was the last day before the Philippine Republic was established. So Vargas, who was reading the response, was recognized as the chairman. And the government departments were called commissions. And each commission had a Japanese advisor. Actually, they were spies. And since Laurel headed the Commission on Justice, he felt insulted because the advisor said to him, "Oh, I should be his advisor, not him being my advisor." And the Japanese interfered with the legal process. For example, they'd come into the court and tell the judge to dismiss a case against a certain Japanese person or a pro-Japanese Filipino, and the Japanese would disrupt proceedings, forcing the judge to hide under the table. Now, while the Battle of Bataan was raging, there were now Filipinos collaborating with the Japanese. I already mentioned Aguinaldo, who appealed to the Filipinos in the USAPE to lay down their weapons and join the Japanese because they are our liberators. And the radio message was caught by the Americans and said, "What will happen to Aguinaldo when we come back? He's an old man. He will go to jail. He'll probably be executed." Another one was Artemio Ricarte, the man who never swore allegiance to the Americans. So, as you know, Ricarte refused to swear allegiance to the Americans after fighting in the Philippine-American War. He he was deported to Hong Kong, smuggled himself back, he was captured, and when he was released, the Americans tried to have him swear allegiance to them. He refused, so he went back to Hong Kong. The British don't want him there, so he went to China. The Chinese don't want him there, so he went to Japan, where he remained until the Japanese invaded the Philippines in 1941. And upon arriving, he said he was coming to break the chains of American imperialism. Another person who was now collaborating with the Japanese was the head of the Sakdal, the former head of the Sakdal party, Benigno Ramos, and later became the head of the Ganap. At the time when the Japanese came, he was imprisoned. The Japanese released him from prison, and he began adhering to the Japanese. And he was hoping that he would become a member of the Philippine Executive Commission or become even president of the Philippines. There was initial hesitancy on the part of the Philippine leaders because of the threat of MacArthur. If the Americans came back, they might be subjected to the firing squad. But later, they conditioned themselves that it was all right to collaborate because, number one, the Americans were not anymore here. They failed to defend the country. And they cited the principle, the legal principle of suspended sovereignty, meaning the sovereignty, the loyalty of allegiance of the Filipinos and Americans was suspended because of the enemy occupation. Soon, they began to collaborate more openly. Okay, and this would be seen by the American intelligence community, and that is why they sent spies to see who among the Filipinos were actually collaborating and those who were just pretending to collaborate with the Japanese. Some Filipinos remain steadfastly loyal to the United States and the Philippine Commonwealth. We already know the story of Chief Justice Jose Abad Santos. He refused to collaborate. The Japanese became exasperated with him, and so they killed him by firing squad. Okay, and also see this one, Wenceslao Binsons. When the Japanese came, he formed among the first guerrilla movements in the Philippines. He was captured with the help of his relatives and political enemies, and he was told to collaborate and said, no, we will just resist you, and so he was executed. While Jose Ablan, when the Japanese came, he formed his own, like Binsons formed his own guerrilla unit. In one of the battles, he was missing in action and presumed dead. Okay, they paid with their lives. But meanwhile, there are some Filipinos who continued living by collaborating with the enemy. Are they traitors? So others took the heart of the instruction of Quezon. Do everything except take the oath of allegiance to the Japanese, meaning they did whatever they could to protect the Filipinos. They collaborated with the enemy. At the same time, they also extended help to the Filipinos. How did they do that? Number one, by shielding some guerrillas, also by providing passage to guerrillas, and also by towing the line, collaborating with the guerrillas, at the same time collaborating with the enemy. Many Filipinos actually did that. Okay, some collaborators collaborated openly, willingly, even enthusiastically, such as this man, Benigno Aquino Sr. He said that Americans will not come back, and he chided the Filipinos for being fence-sitters, and that the destiny of the Filipinos lay with the Japanese. And he said that if I were lying, I'd be willing to face the firing squad if I did not give my collaboration to the Japanese. So, meaning he was willing, was all out and out in collaborating with the Japanese. Even his fellow collaborators, like Vargas, said, I don't know what's wrong with him. Why is he doing this? Okay? So he's sobra na yan, sobra pag-collaborate niya. So he would, Benigno Sr. even tell his son and Ninoy, Benigno Aquino Jr., when the Japanese were parading or marching the prisoners of war from Bataan, he said, oh, these are the, he'd point to them, these are the prisoners. So he was like as if he was trying to shame the prisoners. And also we have Benigno Ramos. I already told him that. And also we have Pio Duran, who was a Japanophile, meaning one who openly adhered to the objectives of Japan. And of course, we have Manuel Rojas. But in some point in time, he began collaborating rather scarcely. Okay, some collaborators had guerrilla links, like Senator Jose Ozamis, and the Japanese found intelligence information that he had links to the Japanese, and thus he was executed. Manuel Rojas was found to have links with the Japanese, especially after the capture of General Lim, and he was implicated, and the Japanese Kempeitai wanted him executed, but President Laurel refused to hand him over. Okay, so the Japanese, in order to make the Filipinos collaborate more and more enthusiastically, announced that they would give the Philippines the honor of independence if they showed more tangible evidence of collaboration. He said this twice. First, when he visited the Philippines. Second, when he addressed the Japanese Diet. And so upon hearing this, the Filipinos, especially headed by Executive Commissioner Vargas, held gratitude rallies. And soon, a preparatory committee for Philippine independence was formed. And Laurel was perceived to be collaborating too closely that he was nearly assassinated by the guerrillas. He didn't die because the Japanese sent their best men to operate on him. And meanwhile, Vargas was eased out while Laurel was played up. And later, the Philippine Constitution was approved, and Laurel was elected president by the Philippine Assembly. And on October 14, 1943, he was proclaimed as inaugurated as president of the new Republic of the Philippines. Okay, so now how about the other Filipinos? There are many Filipinos who collaborated with Japan. Many of them became members of the Kalibapi, the kapisanan sa paglilingkod sa bagong Pilipinas, and they had to join because all the political parties were abolished, including the Girl Scouts, Boy Scouts, the Student Catholic Action, they're all abolished. Only one organization was allowed. That was the Kalibapi. And there were economic benefits for joining the Kalibapi. If you're a member of Kalibapi, you'll get cheaper goods. You have access to cheaper supplies like cooking oil, rice. If you're not, you will starve. And they also become members of pro-Japanese groups. Like the Palaaks. Sometimes they join as entertainers and comfort women of the Japanese, and also as servants of the Japanese. So before the Philippine Republic was inaugurated, Laurel was told by Prime Minister Tojo to declare war on the U.S. and the United Kingdom. He refused this request because if he did so, it will cause division among the Filipinos. And the Japanese decided not to insist. And what he did only he did only so after September 22, 1944. So when the Philippine Republic was inaugurated, Laurel, Clara M. Recto, who was the Minister of Foreign Affairs, produces a limited document. Instead of an outright declaration of war, he produced a pact of alliance between the Philippines and Japan. Under that pact of alliance, the Philippines will provide all resources for the Japanese war effort except providing Filipino troops. Okay, and Laurel never committed Filipino troops to fight for Japan. Okay, as Philippine president, Laurel upheld independence as the president of the Philippines. First, he refused to hand over Rojas to the Kempeitai. He kicked out his Japanese advisors. He kept a radio receiver in Malacanang in violation to the wishes of the Japanese that they only receive Japanese broadcasts. He issued passes to guerrillas and released detainees and proclaimed amnesty to the guerrillas. So far from being a puppet, and he actually upheld Philippine independence. But the real test came when the Americans started bombing the Philippines, started bombing Manila on September 21, 1944. Now that the Philippines is being attacked by the Americans, the Japanese asked him to declare war on the United States. And what he did was to declare a state of war. So in his mind, declaring war is different from declaring a state of war, because a state of war would just be an affirmation of what was actually happening. But in the ears of the Americans, declaring war and declaring a state of war is just the same. But the proclamation was fraught with legal infirmities. Number one, the proclamation should be approved by the Philippine Assembly. But Laurel at that time already declared martial law, and the members of the Assembly already went to their homes and their provinces. And as he said, they're now playing hide and seek. And what else? And that he, by his authority as president, he's the one who had the power to do so. In short, he kept the blame to himself. So, and why not a real declaration of war? The Japanese asked, because if I declare war, even the young men of the Philippines, many of them were killed in Bataan. There'll be no more for the future. So if I declare war and have them fight their war for you, all the generation of Filipinos will be lost. So the Japanese became so disappointed with Laurel that by December 8, 1944, they formed the Malayang Kalipunan ng mga Pilipino, otherwise known as Makapili, which was independent of Laurel. And it was now under the command of the Japanese Commander-in-Chief, General Tomoyuki Yamashita. And Laurel was forced to attend its inauguration ceremony in Malacanang, and he warned them against turning traitor to their own country. True enough, these Makapilis killed a lot of people. They burned a large part of Manila and the surrounding cities. Meanwhile, Laurel was evacuated to Japan, and in Nara, Japan, he dissolved the Philippine Republic. But the Americans had him arrested, and Laurel spent time at the Sugano prison in Tokyo before sending him to the new Bilibid prison. Other officials like Recto, Laurel, Antonio de las Alas, Rafael Alunan, Camilo Osias, Vicente Madrigal, they're confined in Iwahig and later at the prison in short, they were put in prison. Ayan, so the Americans had a distorted sense of justice because while they imprisoned Laurel, Recto, and others, they released officials like Rojas and General Capinpin, who were both collaborators during the war. So, yeah. So, General Guillermo Francisco, who was a Bataan veteran, after the after the Battle of Bataan, after they were released from prison, they served in with the Japanese. Especially General Francisco was the head of the Bureau Constabulary at that time. At the same time, Kapinpin was also an official of the peace and order authorities. And according to the reasoning of the Japanese, Francisco was a collaborator, therefore should be tried as a traitor. While Kapinpin was working against his will. He was forced against his will. Actually, the situation was the same. So why different treatment for this man, Francisco, and different treatment for Kapinpin? And there's a different treatment for Rojas, and there's a different treatment for Recto and Laurel. Yeah? So, yan. So, while Laurel, Recto, Vargas, and others were jailed, Rojas was liberated and he was free to move around, even pursue his political career, eventually prepare for the presidential elections in 1946. So, and also when the Philippine Congress was reconstituted, most of the congressmen and senators who survived were collaborators. Okay, so, and in the elections of April 1946, Rojas and Quirino, who were both collaborators, were elected as president and vice president. By the way, the Americans even forced President Osmeña to try the collaborators. Since the Congress was composed of collaborators, the law creating the court was very weak. It allowed only 6 months for a filed case against collaborators. And there are more than 5,556 cases that were filed. And this special court called the Philippine People's Court and the Office of Special Prosecutors. So it was poorly supported. It had no vehicles. It was housed in a very old building, very few equipment. And what is worse, that the Americans, General MacArthur told the U.S. forces, especially the counterintelligence corps, not to get involved in the prosecution collaborators. By the way, the court was held by, but the chief prosecutor was Lorenzo Tañada, and the court was composed of 5 divisions, who were composed of lawyers who were not involved in collaboration, and later, while the trials for collaboration were being done, the U.S. announced that they would support whoever was elected president, because it was too busy minding the spread of world communism. And even people who fought the Americans were being relied on to fight the communists. For example, this man, si Masanobu Tsuda, who was instrumental in the Sukching massacre in Singapore. And he was also suspected as having a hand in the death of Chief Justice Jose Abad Santos. The Americans used him in fighting communists in Indochina, and he's honored with a statue in Tokyo. And there's also this Colonel Shuji, who was the head of the Unit 731, the one who headed the biological warfare experiment in Manchuria. He was never persecuted. He was never punished. While people like Laurel stayed in jail. Okay, so it was, again, the People's Court trials are fraught with difficulties. The difficulty of the 2 witness rules. Witnesses were harassed, threatened, even threatened with death. And there's also this Filipino attitude of, pabayaan mo na lang yun. Ipasa Diyos mo na lang yun. Let God take care of it. And also there's a lack of logistics. And the Filipinos, according to many, were forgiving people. Oh, forgive and forget na lang. Let the past be past, and there's water under the bridge. Really. In the trials, only one prominent political collaborator was convicted, and he was Teofilo Sison. Yan. While the others were acquitted. Their argument was like this: mere government service in the occupation government is not treason. Osias was head of a commission of commissioner of education, so he was just providing educational services. Therefore, government service, providing service to the people, therefore not guilty. Paredes was head of public works, so therefore just providing service to maintain the roads, so therefore not guilty. Yan. So Rafael Alunan, agriculture is not is providing food for the people. So therefore not guilty. Madrigal, he was a member of the commission, and just by sitting there, so not guilty. Yan. But Sison, because of his pronouncements showing his adherence to the enemy, he was judged guilty. But on the day of his judgment, he appealed to the Supreme Court. So, meanwhile, people start to lose in the treason trials, except for the trial of Laurel, in which he showed that he justified his collaboration, and instead of condemning him as a collaborator and a traitor, the people began to realize that he was a hero. He saved a lot of people. Thus, in the following years, I believe it was 1947, Rojas finally declared amnesty for political, economic, and cultural collaborators. But the ones who should continue their trial are the military collaborators. Actually, only around 300 benefited from the amnesty, while more than 3,000, consisting of poor makapilis, remain in jail. Yeah. So now, moving forward, is it true that the Filipinos were a forgiving people? That pabayaan mo na yan, isa-Diyos mo na yan, ano, that pass be passed? The answer is wrong, because collaboration became elections issue in the election of 1949, when Quirino, who was a collaborator, clashed with Laurel, who was also a collaborator. Also, that also happened in 1972, when Marcos accused Sergio Osmeña Jr., this man, of being a collaborator. By the way, he was a convicted economic collaborator. He was not just accused, but convicted. And also Ninoy Aquino, because he was the son of a collaborator. And later, you know the story about what happened in Sabah. So what happened in why did Ninoy colluded with the members of the Communist Party? But that's another story. Huh? So mga nag-traidor daw sa bayan. So yeah, so collaboration continued to haunt the Philippines. And there were also cases of revenge killings. Because even after the collaborators stayed in jail, they served their sentences, they were surprised to find out there are former guerrillas waiting for them outside of the prison, and they're waiting to murder them. There are cases of many former Makapilis who were murdered out of revenge. And at the same time, Makapilis would fight back. Even until the 1980s, there were cases reported on revenge killing. And the former guerrillas formed trigger squads to hunt collaborators, especially those who cause death and destruction. Okay, even today, they say, why should marry that person? He was a collaborator. Why should you marry that son of that person? He was a collaborator. And there were people who were very evil collaborators at that time, like Francisco Vera Cruz. So he was the worst collaborator of among the Filipinos. And also we have Benigno Ramos. After the war, nothing was known about him. But again, I'll talk about Pio Duran later. Okay, which also brings us, by the way, to this question: who will defend the country when we are invaded again? I'm talking about when, meaning it will happen. I'm not talking about if. I'm talking about when. The invasion may happen subtly. It may not be an armed landing in some part of the country, but it could be a subtle invasion. It could be infiltration of our political institutions. So people will be conditioned to collaborate. Why? Because collaborators are rewarded and honored. We have at least 2 presidents who were collaborators, and they are honored. It is very easy to betray the country. Why? Said that. Well, because they are our friends. I heard one president say so. Huh? So many people are serving mouthpieces for other countries. And even today, you go to Albay, you look at the name of this town, it's named after a collaborator. So you name a country, a town after a collaborator. Pio Duran was one of the founders of the Makapili. Why name a town after him? And maybe as a joke, some people would put this poster or tarpaulin saying the Philippines is a province of China. Again, this is what I call conditioning. They're trying to condition us to accept domination by another country. Yeah, so and again, if you are caught collaborating, you're caught as a traitor, the punishment is only 20,000 pesos. Okay? And the treason law requires that nobody can be accused of treason if there's no war. But there are also already other people who are saying that we owe this country a lot of utang na loob. So, utang na loob natin sa ganyang bansa because they gave us free vaccines. And he was willing to shake his hand, shake the hand of their leader. So, and openly, he would say that without threat of punishment. Meanwhile, the real heroes are there struggling. So, is collaboration with the enemy treason? The answer is no, because not all collaboration is treason. According to Laurel, there can be nationalism in collaboration. It only depends on the particular circumstance. Ayan. So again, you're subjecting it to various interpretations, which makes it, in my view, quite dangerous. So the real traitors are those who benefited from their collaboration with the enemy, those who became rich by collaborating with them, by enhancing their careers, by collaborating with them. Marami dyan na-promote because they collaborated with another enemy, compromising the situation of their own country. Those who demoralize the country in favor of another country, they're the traitors. But we cannot punish them because there's no war. And those who cause death and destruction while serving with the enemy. So this would be what we call the makabagong makapil. Those people who betray their own country for others. So I leave you with this question. So, up to what extent are you going to collaborate? My guideline is that always look towards the national interest. National interest first, rather than utang na loob with another country. That is what one president should have said. Wag na utang na loob natin sa ganyang bansa. Dahil binigyan tayo ng bagong bakuna. Again, he can have those vaccines injected somewhere. And also, but it should be national interest that should guide our collaboration with other countries. National interest first. Dapat unahin ng bansa bago ang iba. Huwag natin ibahin, huwag natin dagdagan ng, utang na loob natin sa kanila. Kumampi tayo sa kanila. I love this country. But again, do you love your own country? This is the land of your birth. This is where you made your pile. And this is where you created your own identity. Love it. Because according to Laurel himself, love your own fellow men, because nobody else would love you more. And again, there's another one from Thomas Jefferson. Love your own country. Even there's no country that started out as heaven, but it is your own. Thank you very much.
Sir Viana.
Yes, and we would like to acknowledge the presence of Dr. Resos and the UST History Department here in our Zoom meeting. Now, we open the floor for questions from the audience and the public. For our Facebook viewers, please place your questions on the comment section, and for the Zoom participants, please place your questions on our chat box. So, I believe we have our first question. Dr. Viana?
Yes. Yes. Can you hear me?
Yes, very loud and clear, sir.
Yeah, thank you very much.
Sir, we have our first question from Facebook from Al Mukhtar Musa. I would like to ask, when few or some Filipinos started the collaboration, did this somehow develop distrust among Filipino people, especially those that oppose the Japanese rule?
Yeah, actually, before I answer that question, I'd like to make some corrections. First, when Hislao Binsons was captured, he was betrayed by a political enemy. I'm not very sure about the relatives. Second is the election issue. It's not 1972, but actually 1969. So I like to make a correction in my PowerPoint. In the election of 1969, Marcos was running for re-election, and his chief political rival was Sergio Osmeña Jr. And Marcos portrayed him as a collaborator, not just a collaborator, but actual convict, because he was actually convicted of economic collaboration. Now, going back to the question, collaboration started again because there was no plan. People were conditioned that the Americans will defend the Philippines and the Japanese will be driven off. So it never came to their mind that the Philippines will be occupied. And thus, when December 8, 1941 happened, and all American air power were destroyed on the ground, and the Japanese started landing in various parts of the Philippines. And the scenario came that it is inevitable that people will collaborate with the enemy because this country will be occupied. I think, did I answer the question? So again, the country will be occupied, and therefore there's a question raised by Vargas and Laurel: up to what extent shall we collaborate? it is and General MacArthur, I like to stress that and when you get occupied, it is inevitable that you'll have some communication or involvement with the occupiers, and of course you should cooperate. And MacArthur actually said that. And by the way, I think I did not mention in my lecture that when the Japanese came, Masami Maeda, the head of the Japanese military administration, required all Filipino officials to swear allegiance to Japan. Again, that will be violating MacArthur's instructions. But lucky for them, we have Vargas, who knew international law, and he said that occupied citizens of an occupied territory need not swear allegiance, but the Japanese kept on bringing it up, and they came up with a compromise. So we will swear allegiance to you, the official, but not your country. So that's Vargas found a way out, and of course there are varying degrees of collaboration, and of course there were some people who were feigning or collaboration or actually enthusiastically collaborating. And another one would situation that caused collaboration is that the belief that the Americans were already defeated, they failed in defending the country, and therefore their sovereignty was suspended, and therefore it is now okay to collaborate. But the problem here is that the Americans came back and they started to finding accountabilities for those who have collaborated. Thank you.
Okay, thank you very much, Dr. Viana.
Okay, next question, sir. This is from Blas Bermudez from Facebook. What happened to Secretary Teofilo Sison?
Teofilo Sison was he appealed to the Supreme Court, and of course, while the case was on appeal, and then came the amnesty proclamation of President Rojas in 1947, and therefore he was under the amnesty. Yeah. So, but I might also add that there are some officials who refused to accept the amnesty. This included Laurel, Vargas, and Recto, and they said that amnesty is not enough. So because it also retains a stigma because you're just amnestied by decree, they really want to have an acquittal by the court, and that really happened.
Thank you, sir.
Okay, we now have one question that is, I guess, more subjective. What is the what is the significance of studying this dark age of our history?
Again, this is very important because especially now that we are practicing internationalism and also geopolitics, and you'll find some people who appear to be adhering to another country and placing, I think, even showing some kind of allegiance to another country instead of themselves. So we should be aware and we should be alarmed. Especially there are some people, for example, they are serving as subalterns for another country. So, as I said, national interest should be the guide of all public officials, not just the so-called utang na loob with another country, or maybe this country offers a business opportunity for you, but by doing so, you are actually endangering your own and placing your own country as a disadvantage, and that should not be allowed. That is why one of the readers of my book, Collaborator, said, "Oh, the issue of collaboration is very relevant because they are presently today, even today, present-day collaborators siding with another foreign power." Thank you.
Okay, thank you very much, Doctor.
Thank you, sir. A very good point indeed. Next question, sir. This is from Mr. Ray G. Carolina from Zoom. After the Americans had retaken Manila in 1945, Aguinaldo was accused and arrested as a Japanese collaborator and was imprisoned for some months. He was released via presidential amnesty by then President Manuel Rojas. What is the general concession by historians regarding Aguinaldo as a Japanese collaborator?
General Aguinaldo was indicted for his role. And of course, even during the occupation, together with Recarte, they were actually somehow presenting themselves as alternatives to Laurel. And for that, and of course of his pronouncements, the American, especially Secretary Harold Ikes, knowing the age of the frailness of the age of General Aguinaldo, saying that he could be held accountable. So that is one of the what I think the lowest point of his historical career. Imagine at a young age you are president of the Philippines, and then you get defeated by Quezon, and you try to redeem yourself by becoming a mouthpiece of the Japanese. And I think that it's quite sad. That's why even Mabini once said that this man, Aguinaldo, would have been one of the greatest heroes of our time. And that would have been best if he died in the field of battle. But the problem was that he lived too long. He lived to the ripe old age of 95. And he would be used by the Americans after he swore allegiance to them to convince all his fellow revolutionaries to come down the mountains and accept American rule. And then he would be superseded by younger persons like Quezon. Yeah, so again, that is a quite if you make a commentary, he actually went downhill. If I that's my opinion.
Thank you, sir.
We have another question from Zoom. This is from Danilo Tinglay. Sir, matatawag bang modern collaborators ang mga nagsasabi na wag tayong awayin ng China kasi wala tayong laban sa kanila, sir? Respectively.
Hindi naman. They're just probably pragmatists. Siyempre wag hindi dapat tayo makipag-away. We should not be starting fights. And of course, that is also against our national policy. War should never be part of the national policy. Only in defense. So, gaya sinabi ni former Associate Justice Antonio Carpio, hindi naman tayo makipag-away eh. We only insist on our own. I think we should insist on our rights. What is ours, we should defend it. And especially in the case of, if you are listening to the news now, so if the government is allowing foreign vessels to fish on our EEZ, the very exclusive economic zone, the very words of EEZ, the first E is actually exclusive economic zone. It should be reserved for Filipinos. And Philippine law should be followed, and we should defend our own interests. Ayun lang yung masasabi ko.
Thank you very much, sir, for your insight.
Okay. Next question. This is from Nigel Tan from Facebook. Did the exoneration of many collaborators, especially among the elite, fuel the subsequent communist hook uprising in the Philippines?
Yeah, when the proclamation of Rojas came out, the amnesty benefited only the political, economic, and cultural collaborators who are actually a minority, and they included quite affluent people. Mayaman sila. That's why, as a commentary, Solicitor General Lorenzo Tañada said, "This is the amnesty for the big time, for the big time." So parang kung sino mayaman, kung sino malakas siya ang ano. Samantala yung mga medyo mahirap, sila ang nakakulong. They ones who stayed in jail. And this include the poor unlettered people or people who are just trying to earn income. Unfortunately, they joined an armed group, which is used to fight fellow Filipinos. Although there are some people who took up arms who genuinely believe in their purpose. Some of them are actually convinced that they're joining armed groups like the Makapili. I actually interviewed one former Makapili a few decades ago. Sabi sa akin, he told me that when the Japanese came, by the way, during the American period, all the lands were owned by rich people and who were supported by the Americans. Okay, and when the Japanese came, they saw the Japanese at the very words he said was magkabalat pala tayo, and they welcomed them as fellow liberators, as their liberators, and that is why they sided with them. So they see the nobility in their collaboration. So some of them actually joined the armed groups because they were opportunists, because it's a chance to hold a weapon and hold power, and also a chance to get back at their enemies. Yung mga ibang mga tinuro ng Makapili ay mga kaaway nila sa personal o kaya sa politika. So meron ganun. Unfortunately, many of them stayed in jail. I interviewed some of them, and some of them stayed in jail as far as 15 years. Suffering did not end with imprisonment, because waiting outside the gates of the Bilibid would be former guerrillas who were waiting to exact vengeance on them. Binabantayan sila sa labas, and I knew some of them got liquidated. I also interviewed some former guerrillas, and they said, they even told me, by the way, those former guerrillas are dead now. I can tell their stories. Hinanap nila at pinatay. Although merong isang, I know they took a pair of pliers and they snip up a part of their ears, and now they are branded forever. So, ayun. And when I visited some of their homes, they were actually stigmatized because who would become friends with them? They're traitors, they're Makapili, and their children also bear the same stigma. So these are the poor people, but there are some who are rich, and as I said, one of them had a town named after him, Sap Albay. Okay.
Thank you very much, sir. Before we proceed to the next question, I like to read one message from Facebook. This is from Jazel Makasakit Padriquez Ortilia. Thank you so much, Sir De Viana. I've learned so much regarding this topic. You're really one of my best professors in history when I was in college. More power, sir. I'm sure your students agree with that sentiment, sir.
Thank you.
Okay, next question. This is from Kiefer Zachary Hipe. There are recent pronouncements that people consider as defeatist statements. Is this considered as conditioning for collaboration?
Yeah, again, times are changing, and there are many ways of waging war nowadays. It could be not anymore the classic of an army landing on your shores and taking over. It could be a subtle invasion. That's like what happened in Thailand just before the Second World War, the Pacific War, wherein the government of Siam, the name of Thailand at the time, was slowly being infiltrated by pro-Japanese elements. And soon, the government was so infiltrated that the Japanese just marched over the border from Cambodia and into Siam. So that's one thing. And you're infiltrated by in that case Japanophiles, people who adhered themselves to Japan at the time, and you can see that in even today, when some leaders would condition your minds that without the country's help, we are nothing. That even happened even before the influence of China, because we also have that with the United States, especially after 1946. The adherence to the United States was so close that there's even some people who are advocating that we should give up our independence and campaign for statehood, and that happened actually. And luckily for us, there are some Filipinos who are sensible enough to preserve the labors and sacrifices of our heroes who fought for our independence. Yes.
Okay, thank you very much, sir. Okay, we have our next question. This is from Neil Gian Junio from Zoom. Nagkaroon po ba ng argumento ang mga tinawag na Japanese collaborator sa kanilang mga naging kalaban na American collaborator?
In my research work, I came out with a rather funny analogy. Sabi nila, "Uy, yung mga hukbalahap, kampiyan sa Russia and China. Yung mga USAF, Amerika yan. So, yung mga makapilis hapon." But it's so simplistic. So, nagkita ba sila? The answer is yes. I could relate you a story when I was still with the National Historical Institute. It was already more than 70 years since the end of the Second World War, and that would be in 2005. And we managed to get the Makapilis who are still alive and the guerrillas, and even the victims of the Makapilis and guerrillas meeting in one room in Fort Santiago. I managed to do that. And they discussed, bakit kayo nag-guerrilla? Bakit kayo nagmakapili? At anong feeling niyo sa mga makapili at sa mga guerrilla? Siyempre, it's I expected the worst actually. Baka magsuntukan sila. They're already in their 80s, and Filipinos actually have a long memory, and they cannot forgive and forget that. Again, contrary to what is being said that Filipinos usually forgive and forget, they actually remember. So the Makapili would say they joined or formed their group in the belief that the Japanese were liberators. Number one. They may be mistaken, but that's their belief. And number two is that it was a way to fight their economic situation, because they were downtrodden by landlords who are supported by the Americans. So ayun, they feel that the Japanese might free them from their economic problem. As for the guerrillas, bakit ka nag-guerrilla? The reason was surprising. Not because dahil wala sila sinabi na nag-guerrilla ako kasi mahal kong Pilipinas. I did not hear them. Nag-guerrilla ako kasi inapi ako ng mga Hapon. Pinatay nila ang pinsan ko, pinatay nila lolo ko, pinatay nila ama ko, kaya ako nag-guerrilla. Wala silang sinabi na ano. I only heard only one or two guerrillas who said that they joined the guerrillas because the Japanese were invaders and because I'm fighting for my country. I had only two of guerrillas who say that. But most of them said, join ako ng guerrilla, sana kami sa guerrilla kasi inapi kami. At one point in time, we were the victims and we are fighting back. Now, how about the victims? And of course, all of them point to the Makapilis. Yung mga Makapili, sila sinasabi nagtuturo at dahil doon maraming namatay sa kanila. Nagtuturo o kaya they serve as guides and informants of the Japanese. There was no one among them. By the way, you can make a study about this because there's also a study whether the guerrillas committed atrocities against civilians. There are stories about that also, but they're not present in the region or the place where I conducted the study. But in some places where guerrillas so persons posing as guerrillas committed crimes like robbery, rape, murder. Maraming ganun. Kaya nga sabi nga ni Senator Salipada Pendatun, if you're giving an amnesty for the Makapilis, you should give amnesty to the guerrillas who committed crimes in the name of the resistance movement. So those are some of the unanswered questions of World War II. But in one full sweep of his pen, President Rojas signed his proclamation order for amnesty. I think that is, if I'm not mistaken, that's proclamation number 30, and proclaiming amnesty for all economic, political, and cultural collaborators. Actually, may isa pang problem dyan. There's some collaborators who became very rich by collaborating, and Rojas gave a rather weak answer because he said, with our tax system, we will tax them until their wealth is gone. I don't believe that really happened because some of them continued on. So it's what you call a very weak answer. Yes, thank you.
Thank you very much, sir.
Thank you, sir. Very interesting discovery. And next question. This is from Joseph Salamatin from Zoom. How about Sir Jose C. Laurel and the other government officials who followed the instructions of President Quezon and still helped the Filipino people while collaborating with the enemy? Can we consider their actions of collaboration justifiable? And can an action of collaboration ever be justified for the sake of the country?
Yeah, so many collaborators use Quezon's message, but during the trial, it's quite unfortunate that Quezon was already dead, and how can you quote a person who's already dead? So that's one problem of people who are accused of collaborating, because they would just quote Quezon and saying that they did that because they want to protect the people. So and they even produced the book of Quezon, The Good Fight, and he said that he said those people are not traitors. He actually said that in his book. That served as one of the exhibits in the defense. And Tanyada would dismiss the book, saying, "Oh, this was a book made by a dead man, and we cannot cross-examine him." And many people, prison indictees used Quezon's book as their defense, that they tried to save the people. But again, it boils down to my theoretical framework. So there are some people who collaborated, some of them resisted, some of them collaborated and resisted at the same time. There are also some people who collaborated when when the Americans were winning, they start supporting the guerrillas. In fact, Benigno Aquino Sr. Said that in his trial, that he claimed that he had contact with guerrillas. The same with Jose Yulo, and that he even had a nom de guerre. He was called Joseph Yule, showing that he had some contacts with the guerrillas. So failing with the excuse of Quezon that they were just doing his instructions, they resort to this argument that they are now in support of the guerrillas. Especially, by the way, when Rojas was personally exonerated by MacArthur, said he's not a collaborator. He's communicating with our command in South Pacific, and that is how Rojas was never tried, and many collaborators in the government started to use Quezon's Rojas formula. Okay? Marami rin nag-claim na, meron kami link sa mga guerrillas. We help guerrillas. Yeah.
Okay, thank you very much, sir, for that clarification. We have a question from Facebook from Blas Bermudez. They would like to know your opinion regarding these people, if they are traitors or considered traitors or collaborators. These are General Ricarte and General Paulino Santos. Are they supposedly collaborators?
General Ricarte owes no allegiance to the Americans because he never swore allegiance to them. So, and of course, from the standpoint whether you levied war on collaboration was based on the violation of allegiance to the U.S. government and the Philippine government. Ricarte never had any allegiance to both, so therefore he was not. You cannot call him a traitor. You cannot call him a traitor because he had no allegiance to the Commonwealth government. Because the premise for collaboration in the trials was that the collaborator, the person accused of treason, violated his allegiance to the Commonwealth government and the U.S. And Ricarte had none of those, so therefore he was no traitor. He was no traitor. The question is that he levied war on the Filipinos. So the answer was still no, because even when he was used as a propaganda tool by the Japanese, he issued passes to guerrillas. He issued of course he never intended the Makapili to become an army against the Filipino people. I think other people were responsible for that. That would be Benigno Ramos, especially Benigno Ramos. By the way, I'd like to make another correction. May sinabi kong Mr. Vera Cruz. It should be Franco Vera Reyes. He was the worst of the military collaborators. He would be he was responsible for killing a lot of Filipinos during his time, and I think some other people already discussed him. How about General Paulino Santos? I'm not very familiar with Paulino Santos. I'm sorry, I cannot comment.
Okay, thank you very much, sir.
Next question, sir. A while ago, you have mentioned in passing Benigno Aquino Sr. Now, Sheila Garcia would like to know, aside from being a collaborator, totoo po bang si Benigno Aquino Sr. ay makapili rin po?
Hindi siya makapili. He's not a makapili because he was not one of the founders. What made him, sometimes he was denounced by his fellow collaborators. Vargas wrote that in his memoirs. Why is he acting like this? Parang, I think he'd gone overboard in collaborating. So I think the collaborators functioned up to what up to a certain level, but again showing extreme adherence to the Japanese. And he said, why are you Filipinos are not collaborating fully? You're just fence-sitters, and the Americans are gone. If they come back, I'm willing to be put in front of the firing squad. He actually said that. So he's not a Makapili, but he adhered so much to the Japanese, and he made so many pronouncements of adherence to the Japanese, and when he was confined in jail, he was now just saying that he had some links to the guerrillas, and that he denied some things that he said, and he develops an Americanism, anti-Americanism, that he began to hate the United States. In fact, there was a story in jail. And the witnesses were Antonio de las Alas, and he said that Aquino would do a hunger strike, just like his son did during the time of Marcos. He would even punch a guard, susuntukin daw yung guardia. And by the way, Laurel was also there, and Laurel told him, stop this, itigil mo yan, itigil mo yan tonteria mo, tonteria. Those were his very words. And the two will fight in jail, and and eventually he would calm down. But again, Benigno Aquino Sr. was never convicted of collaboration. Why? Because he died. While his trial was in progress, he suffered from a heart attack and died. The story was he was watching a boxing match involving this Filipino fighter fighting a Mexican fighter, and the Filipino lost, and Benigno Sr. suffered a heart attack and died. And thus, he was never convicted of treason because of his death.
Okay, thank you very much, sir. In relation to supposed collaborators, Scotty Michael Q. Navarro from Zoom would like to know, sa inyo pong palagay, matatawag po bang taksil si President Laurel or hindi?
Hindi siya taksil. Number one, kung taksil siya, malamang nagdeklara siya ng talagang giyera laban sa Amerika. And pinalaban niya yung mga Pilipino, pinakampi niya sa mga Hapon. So hindi niya ginawa yon. So he actually avoided throwing Filipinos to fight on the side of Japan, because when he said, if I do that, that will destroy the Philippines, because Filipinos will be fighting fellow Filipinos, the guerrillas on one side, and the pro-Japanese army on the other side. So ayan, hindi siya taksil. At higit sa lahat, gaya sinabi ko, talagang pinagtanggol niya ang independensya ng Pilipinas. So I would also like to say that even when Laurel, even as president, he should have his speeches edited by his Japanese censors. He refused, but instead he began to speak extemporaneously, so that the Japanese will never have the chance to edit his speeches. So ayun, he was never he was actually a nationalist. Pinagtanggol niya. At saka nung finally he came out with the declaration of a state of war, he came out with a very colorful explanation of the state of war. Iba ang declaration of war, iba ang declaration of state of war. But to the ears of the Americans, declaration of war and declaration of state of war are the same. For example, when President Roosevelt declared war on Japan, he said the U.S. government is on a state of war with the Empire of Japan. Ibig sabihin pareho. In fact, some Americans wanted Laurel hanged. Gustong bitayin si Laurel because of that. And MacArthur bragged that he had the hand of preventing the hanging of Laurel. He was bragging, and Recto said, no, Laurel is not guilty of anything. He cannot be tried like General Tojo in Japan because he was not a Class A war criminal, and he never betrayed the Filipinos. In fact, he saved a lot of people. O nga pala, when he declared the state of war, dapat aprobahan yun ng Philippine legislature. Pero ang problema, he declared martial law and dissolved the legislature. So ibig sabihin, kung hinayaan niya ipagtibay ng Philippine legislature yung kanyang declaration of war, sila rin makakasuhan. But hindi eh. Ang ginawa niya, he freed those people by dissolving the National Assembly, and by he himself, he just put it upon himself. Kumbaga, sinolo na lang niya yung burden. He just took the burden to himself. And to me, that is a sign of nationalism. So if there's somebody to blame, blame me. So you cannot pass the blame to the National Assembly or anybody else. And that is how Laurel managed to fool the Japanese. They thought they had a real declaration of war, but actually that proclamation was actually defective. It's legally defective. Kasi kailangan ma-declare yan ng National Assembly in a plenary session. So wala ng National Assembly. Pinakokus nga niya pero hindi plenary yon. So those who are familiar with political science would know this. So iba yung nag-caucus lang, iba yung the legislature in the plenary session. It never happened. So therefore, the declaration of state of war is actually defective. It had no legal it's no legal weight. Thank you.
Thank you very much, sir, for that clarification.
Okay, next question, sir. This is from the Acting Assistant Division Chief of PVAO, VMHD, Sir Jomel Taktakin. Yeah, he said here, sir, base sa general definition ng collaborator, it connotes negative. Meron po bang ibang tawag or termino para mabigyang hustisya ang good collaborators? O dapat po ba magpanukala ng batas or ordinansa para maturuan ang ating mga kababayan sa gray area nito?
Ayun ang problema eh. Pag sinabi mong ang collaborator, pag sinabi mo yung mga kumakampi na sa mga kalaban. So I think pag sinabi mo when say collaborator, using it in the vernacular, collaborator, that's a term with the letter K. So people who actually siding with the enemy. So ano pa may isip nating termino? Kakampi? So allies? So actually ganun din eh. It's also the same. But not, as Laurel said, not all collaboration is treason. It depends on the situation. By the way, if you manage to collaborate with the enemy, like in example of Felipe de Leon, I put him in the PowerPoint. Ang sabi niya kasi, pinilit siya ng Hapon. Maybe he was threatened with death. So, and that is called justifiable collaboration. Halimbawa, merong isang songwriter, pinilit ng isang invader na gumawa ng propaganda song for them. Pag di mo ginawa ito, mamamatay ka. And again, that is an exempting circumstance for treason. So, the fear of losing your life, that is why you collaborated. So that's one. And another one would be mere government service. I already mentioned that. So mere government service is not treasonable collaboration. So may isa pang area. When your collaboration is not really connected to the war effort, and again, that's not treasonable. For example, nag-supply ka lang ng ng apog para sa para sa paglibing ng mga patay ng mga Hapon. So there was one person who was acquitted of that. So ayun, collaborator nga, pero pero hindi criminal collaboration. It's not treason.
Okay, thank you very much, sir. We have another question from Facebook. This is Blas Bermudez. Another prominent collaborator was Aurelio Albero. Some say that he was a misguided nationalist, but he was convicted as a collaborator and was jailed. What is your opinion, sir?
Yes, he was. He was one of the group that formed the Makapili. And also, he also formed as another group that is separate from the Makapili. That's the Bisig Bakal ng mga Tagala. And the purpose of the Bisig Bakal was supposed to defend the Philippines, or the Philippines from the Americans. So tinuring siyang traitor. He was a brilliant student leader during his time. He was also a great poet and also the son of a poetess, si Rosa Sibilia Albero. Ayan, sayang siya. He was a brilliant student. Taga UST siya. I did a research on him, and because of that, there was this charge against him that he led the burning of a large section of Pasay City in 1945. But the court happened to not find sufficient evidence of his role in the burning of that part of Pasay. But his record as the founder of Makapili was definitely established, and that is why he was charged. And unfortunately, in my research, he was jailed twice, but he didn't stay so long in jail. I think he stayed only for 4 years. And after that, he lived until 1958 and until he died of a heart attack. So, traitor ba siya? I think, guys, sinabi mo, I think he was just misunderstood. Misunderstood. Again, this misunderstanding may have led to forming the group that actually caused the burning of a large part of south of Manila. And that is an important fact.
Thank you very much, sir.
And next question, this is from Vanessa from Zoom. Is it because of the natural instinct of human preservation of life or simply for survival? That is why we tend to collaborate historically. Is it one of the causes why we are also regionalistic?
And that is correct. Human survival is the main driving force. I'm not trying to degrade nationalism. We collaborate because you feel that the Japanese came here to free us from Western imperialism. Again, but there are also other dimensions. For example, if you're a politician in the age of Quezon and you're in the shadow of Quezon and Osmeña for so long, like in the case of Benigno Aquino Sr. And now that Quezon and Osmeña were gone, it's time for them to shine. Again, you're talking about political survival and political prominence. So that could be one reason. For an ordinary Filipino, you collaborate because if you don't collaborate, you die. In fact, Congressman Leon Cabarogis, in 1945, in his speech in Congress, he said, malaman mo kung sino dyan ang collaborator, sino yung hindi collaborator. Ang collaborator dyan, yung malusog, nakakain. Samantala yung mga hindi nagko-collaborate, yung mga gutom, yung gula-gulanit, yung mga damit. Ayun. Because the collaborate, especially the economic ones, and maybe also the political ones, they are well-fed. They even have allowed to own cars with the permission of the Japanese occupiers. So, ayun makita mo eh. So, human survival. At marami yung mga hindi nag-collaborate, namatay sa berry-berry, namatay sa gutom. It's also a matter of survival. And many ordinary Filipinos collaborated because if they don't work with the enemy, or work under the enemy, they would starve and they would die. Maraming ganun.
Okay. We have another question from Zoom. This is Lito Lacaba. Why did it take so long for Laurel's group to return to the Philippines from Sugamo prison when at the time Americans were already present in Japan?
Yes. So Laurel was president of the Philippines until August 17, 1945, and he was placed in Sugamo prison. The reason why he was not sent back, number one, the authorities feel that it might not be safe for him to come back. That's why he was kept in the Sugamo prison, and after that, he was sent to the New Bilibid prison. And there are also some collaborators who were jailed in Iwahig. And you know, Iwahig is a very remote place, and they're placed so that they would not be in contact with the populace. And popular sentiment against collaborators was very raw. So maraming galit. People were angry at collaborators. And Benigno Ramos once said this, and said, sino ba ang tunay na kalaban ng Pilipino? Ang tunay na kalaban ng Pilipino ba yung mga dayuhan, yung mga invade? Ang tunay na kalaban yung mga kumampi sa dayuhan at tumulong sa paglulupig ng ating bansa. So again, if Laurel and the safety of Laurel was also one of the reasons, and there are also some claims by MacArthur that he wanted them tried in Japan, but actually Laurel would not be even be included among the Japanese war criminals. Instead, he was decided that the Filipinos themselves should try him, not the Americans.
Okay, next question from Tristan Osteria from Facebook. In your own estimation, how did the Philippine authorities deal with the Axis collaboration vis-a-vis other countries like in Southeast Asia or in Europe? Also, does the present treason law only function in a country basis, or does it also involve foreign or local private entities?
Yes, actually, the Axis was already present in the Philippines before the outbreak of World War II. First, you have the Phalange, which is an organization composed of ethnic Spaniards who were in the Philippines. So they're in the Philippines, and they were sympathetic to the Nazis. So there are Nazi sympathizers in the Philippines even before the outbreak of the Second World War, and they infiltrated several areas of Philippine societies, be it in the academe, be it in industry, and of course, especially when General Francisco Franco and his fascist forces won in Spain, they're very sympathetic, and they, as I said, they infiltrated the several levels of government. When the first bombs by the way, they infiltrated the Civilian Emergency Administration, which was tasked to prepare the Filipinos in case the Japanese would actually attack. And when the Japanese actually attacked the Philippines, the CEA, Civilian Emergency Association, which was supposed to supervise the air raid drills, the evacuation of wounded, the volunteers were found mysteriously with bullets. They're shot behind the head. Somebody shot them from behind, and there was chaos, especially between December 8th and Christmas of 1941, the Kagulo. So with the chaos, it facilitated the coming of the Japanese. There were Axis involvement in the Philippines. There were Nazi sympathizers. And how about, as you said, Mr. Tristan, we said about the rest of Southeast Asia, and the rest of Southeast Asia think of the Japanese as liberators. That is why Malaya Indonesia, they didn't suffer much damage compared to the Philippines, because the Indonesians and Malay considered them as liberators, and there were leaders who actually adhered to the Japanese. And when the British and the Dutch came, they're the ones who were imprisoned. But in the Philippines, because many Filipinos sided with the Americans, and of course there were also some Filipinos, especially Benigno Ramos. Benigno Ramos was the greatest traitor of them all, because he said, "Oh, those collaborators, they are not real collaborators; they are just liars." He said that those collaborators are 95% liars and 5% pro-Americans. He said that openly. And given the chance, Benigno Ramos would like to take over as president of the Philippines, and by staging a coup d'etat and eliminating Laurel. Ayun.
Okay. I believe this is our last question. This is a question from Facebook. This is Ryan Villegas. Do you consider Camilo Osias in the same page as Laurel in being a nationalist?
The answer is yes. There's quite a funny question about Camilo Osias. At the beginning of the Japanese occupation, he was arrested and was accused of being a pro-American, too pro-American. But when the Japanese were defeated, he was now arrested by the Americans for being a collaborator. So again, ano ba talaga sa kanila? So ano ba talaga ako, pro-American o pro-Japanese? But Camilo Osias was just providing educational services. So he did his best to continue the education system. Mind you that during the Japanese occupation, schools were actually running. Even UST, in its campus in Intramuros, continued the classes, like the law class, class of for lawyers, and I think also those for medicine. It was functioned, but save for the main campus, which became an internment camp. Many schools were actually running, and that would be to the credit of Camilo Osias. I even have my aunts, mga tiyahin ko, oy, alam mo, nung panahon ng Hapon, pumapasok pa kami. And the curriculum was changed because we are now required to learn Nihongo. And we are singing in Japanese. So and that's why I was talking about what about now? With the pandemic, will we stop classes? No, we do like what Camilo Osias did in World War II. He kept the educational system running, and there were even graduations. I remember si Senator Jovito Salonga. I think he graduated in 1944. So he was a wartime graduate. So the education system was running during the time. So Camilo Osias, he kept true his word and did what he did best as an educator. So like Laurel, he served the Filipino people. Which also brings another question, which is it important to die for the country or to live and serve the country? I think that answer is given by the late Eulogio Amang Rodriguez, who also endured the war. So he said to die for the country is hard, but to live for the country and serve the people is even harder. Ganun po ang ginawa. These are the people who served the country in the darkest age of the motherland, the darkest hour of the motherland. And they heeded the call of the people to serve them. Ayun po yung mga tao na naglingkod at tumulong kung kailan sa pinakamadilim na bahagi ng ating kasaysayan. And they should be reviled as heroes. They not be reviled as traitors, but as heroes. Unfortunately, itong si Laurel, the label of puppet president persisted for a long time into the 70s, but actually he saved a lot of people. And also those who served with him, they actually served and actually provided help for the people in the darkest hour of need. Thank you very much.
Okay, before we officially conclude this Q&A, our viewers would like to express their gratitude. This is Sheila Garcia. Thank you very much, Dr. Viana, for the very informative webinar. Thank you po, PVAO. God bless po, more power. And we have Mr. Glenn Dale Jango. Thank you for an enlightening lecture, Dr. Viana. It was like I'm attending your class again in UST. Wow.
Thank you. Thank you.
Okay, seeing that there are no more questions, we now end our open forum.
Thank you, sir. Yes, thank you, sir. And we almost didn't notice the time, sir, because we have been learning a lot from you. And we will be seeing you soon on the 27th for the closing ceremony of this historical webinar series, sir. See you soon. See you on the 27th, sir.
Well, okay, thank you very much, everyone, for participating in our Q&A and for sending in your questions. Thank you very much, Professor Viana, for responding to our viewers' questions.
Yes, thank you.
As we now near the end of our program, let us have PVAO's Administrator, Undersecretary Ernesto G. Carolina, for his closing remarks.
Pleasant day to all. As we continue to delve deeper into the long, rich, and colorful history of our country through our Kagitingan webinar series, it is inevitable to come across the darker side of the past. After all, it is only right that we also revisit our fair share of stories about betrayals, conspiracies, and treason. One such example is the topic we discussed in our previous webinar episode, the Makapili and other Filipino paramilitary groups during the Japanese occupation. As a continuation to last week's discussion, we welcome back Professor Augusto V. Viana of the University of Santo Tomas to discuss the issue of political collaboration during World War II. His presentation will shed light on one of the sensitive issues in our history and help us understand collaboration as a human and a national issue. Although the subject of collaborating with enemies is hardly discussed in the present time, the Philippines is no stranger to it. In fact, the Philippines has some of the most ill-reputed traitors in its history. To name a few, Januario Galut, who was a mercenary who led the American Army to the base of General Gregorio del Pilar, which led to the latter's death. And Felipe Bencamino Sr., who shifted his allegiance several times, initially siding with the Spaniards, but switched to the Filipinos and switched again to the Americans. In war, survival is the topmost priority for most people. For those who could not escape to the hills or become guerrillas, not cooperating with the enemy could mean death for them. It was a grim reality for many Filipinos back then. However, for political collaborators driven by ambition, financial gain, vengeance, and even belligerent nationalism and ideology, their self-interest and instinct for political advantage might have led them to forsake their own countrymen. Seeing that the issue on political collaboration during the Second World War is a black stain on our history, and our values as a nation, the idea of allowing it to be completely lost in the annals of history is indeed a tempting one. However, it is our responsibility to learn more and understand better the circumstances that have influenced the course of our history. For doing so would dictate how we should move forward as a nation. As I close my message, allow me to express my gratitude to Dr. Augusto V. de Viana for guiding us in our discussion this afternoon. I would also like to thank everyone who has been with us since day one of our Kagitingan Webinar Series. May the lessons of the past be our guide in preserving the peace of the present and attaining a better future. Mabuhay ang mga bayaning Pilipino, mabuhay ang Pilipinas, mabuhay tayong lahat. Maraming salamat po.
Thank you very much, Undersecretary Carolina. Before we officially end our program, may we now have a photo op together with our resource speaker. To our dear participants, you may now turn on your camera. Again, before we officially end our program, may we now have a photo op together with our resource speaker. To our dear participants, please turn on your camera. Okay. Have another picture. Okay, please prepare for another picture. And for another. Please stand by for another picture. Okay, thank you very much.
And once again, for those who are able to pre-register, we will be sending a link to your email. Kindly accomplish the evaluation form, and you will be receiving your e-certificate after a day. Ladies and gentlemen, we are officially down to our final episode of the Kagitingan, the PVAO Historical Webinar Series 2021. On May 27, we will be joined by Dr. Jose Eleazar R. Bersales, and he will be presenting the history of Cebu during the Second World War. Thereafter, there will be a short closing ceremony where we will be joined by the resource speakers from our previous episode.
Yes, it's very exciting. As we are nearing the end of our historical endeavor, we extend our sincerest appreciation and gratitude to everyone for joining us this afternoon. And we hope to see you at our final episode. I am Nico Oreiro.
And I am Felicia Lois Lanya. We have been your hosts for today. Thank you and good afternoon.